The air in the cottage crackled, thick with the scent of ozone and something ancient, something hungry. Glowing sigils, invisible moments before, now blazed across the floorboards, trapping her between the hearth and the door. Outside, the wolves began to howl, not with wildness, but with the chilling precision of a royal hunt. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The narrative continues. Aurora stood frozen in her small, herb-scented cottage, the familiar aroma of dried lavender and chamomile choked by the sharp, electric tang of raw magic. Her little brother, Leo, coughed weakly from his small bed in the corner, a thin, rattling sound that tore at her heart with every breath. He clutched their large brown Labrador, Bryn, whose deep chest rumbled with a low growl, his hackles raised into a stiff ridge along his spine. The door, carved from solid oak her father had felled 2 decades ago, did not splinter or break. It swung inward with a silent, commanding will, as if yielding to a force that was its master. Alpha King Kael Veyra filled the doorway, his presence a physical weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. He was flanked by 2 guards, monoliths in dark, rune-etched armor that seemed to drink the flickering firelight, but Aurora barely saw them. Her gaze was locked on the king, on his eyes, the color of a frozen lake, which fixed upon her with an unnerving intensity. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and devoid of warmth, like stones grinding together in the dark. He didn't announce himself, he simply stated a fact that had been preordained for generations. The pact is due. You will come with me. Instinct took over. Aurora moved, a fluid motion of desperation, to place herself between the king and Leo's bed, a futile shield of flesh and bone against this crushing power. Her voice trembled, but a spark of defiance she didn't know she possessed ignited within it. He is sick. I can't leave him. Kael's gaze flickered to the small, pale boy, his expression unchanged, utterly unimpressed by the fragility of a human life. Your brother's fate is not my concern. The curse that plagues my bloodline is my curse, your debt. The glowing runes on the floor pulsed, casting the scene in their ethereal, terrifying light, veins of cold fire mapping out her destiny. The air was thick with dread, a suffocating blanket of helplessness. Kael's presence was an invasion, his armor intricately detailed with symbols of snarling wolves and grasping shadows, a testament to the darkness he commanded. Aurora's terror was a living thing in her throat, yet it was eclipsed by the fierce, primal instinct to protect her brother. For a long, stretched moment, Bryn's continuous growl was the only sound, a fragile thread of defiance in the suffocating silence. The journey to the shadowed keep was a blur of cold and misery. They traveled under a sliver of moon, through a dark, gnarled forest whose twisted branches seemed to reach for them like skeletal fingers. Aurora was seated on a powerful warhorse, positioned in front of a stoic guard whose back was as unyielding as a stone wall. Leo, wrapped in every blanket they owned, rode with the other guard, his small, pained coughs echoing in the chilling night air, each one a fresh stab of guilt in Aurora's chest. Bryn was not permitted to ride. He was forced to run alongside on a thick leather leash, his panting breaths mingling with the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats on the damp earth. The forest itself felt like an extension of the king's own nature, a place of grasping shadows and unseen things that rustled just beyond the edge of sight. Kael rode ahead of them all, a solitary figure on a massive black stallion, his back a rigid, unapproachable wall. He never looked back, not once. Aurora tried to speak to the guard who held her, to reason with him, to appeal to any shred of humanity he might possess, but he remained utterly silent, a living statue of duty and obedience. During a brief stop to water the horses at a rushing black stream, she slid from the horse, her limbs stiff and cold. It was then she overheard the 2 guards muttering in low tones, their voices rough and hushed. They spoke of the curse, of how the king's episodes were growing worse, how he had almost transformed during the last full moon, the words painting a picture of a monstrous struggle she could barely comprehend. The cold of the night seeped deep into Aurora's bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill of her growing despair. The weight of her inherited fate, a debt she never agreed to, pressed down on her, threatening to extinguish the last embers of her hope. She clutched a small, smooth stone in her pocket, a simple river rock she and Leo had found on a sunny afternoon that felt a lifetime ago. It was a memento from her parents, her only tangible connection to a life that was now irrevocably over. They arrived at the royal keep as the moon began its descent, a fortress of black stone that seemed to devour what little light the sky offered. It was not a palace, it was a prison, its jagged towers clawing at the heavens. The air within its gates was heavy, thick with the scent of old stone, cold metal, and a faint, underlying odor of decay that clung to the back of the throat. Inside, the halls were vast, empty, and echoing, every footstep a lonely pronouncement in the oppressive silence. Sickly green light pulsed from runes that lined the walls, their glow seeming to absorb warmth rather than create it. Aurora, Leo, and Bryn were led not to a dungeon, but to a suite of rooms that were, in a cruel twist of irony, utterly luxurious. A large fire had been lit in the hearth of the main chamber, but its flames seemed to give off no heat, their light dancing over plush velvet chairs and polished wood like a ghostly imitation of comfort. As the guards retreated, leaving them in the gilded cage, Kael appeared. He was alone this time, and his solitary presence was somehow more menacing than when he was flanked by his men. He stood before Aurora, his shadow stretching long and predatory in the firelight, a tangible manifestation of the darkness that surrounded him. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the terms of their arrangement with a brutal, chilling clarity. "You are not a guest," he began, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "You are a vessel. Your bloodline owes a debt to mine. Your soul will be the payment that breaks a curse passed down for 5 centuries. He took a step closer, invading her space, his sheer size and power overwhelming. The scent of winter and cold iron emanated from him. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper, a sound meant only for her, a secret and a threat all in one. "Do not mistake this for anything else. There will be no affection, no tenderness. I seek your soul, not your love." He leaned in, his frozen lake eyes seeming to pierce right through her, searching for the very essence he had come to claim. "Do not try to find a heart here, Aurora Lane, for you will only find a beast." He turned then and was gone, leaving a profound cold in his wake. Aurora was left standing alone in the vast, opulent room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the wall that writhed and danced like tormented spirits. The luxury of her prison felt like a deliberate mockery, a layer of silk draped over cold, hard chains. The initial, frantic terror she had felt in her cottage began to cool, to harden, solidifying into a core of cold, hard resolve. She looked over at her brother, who had finally succumbed to an exhausted, fitful sleep on a bed large enough for 5 of him, his small face pale in the dim light. She heard Bryn whine softly, nudging Leo's hand with his wet nose. In that moment, watching the 2 beings she loved most in the world, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not simply surrender. Her fate might have been written in ancient pacts and glowing runes, but her story was not yet over. She would not be a willing sacrifice. The first days in the keep unfolded in a suffocating, silent routine. Aurora explored her gilded cage, each discovery a fresh layer of despair. The library was a masterpiece of architecture, a cavernous 2-story rotunda where ladders on brass rails could whisk a reader to the highest shelves. But its contents were a testament to the Veyra obsession. The air smelled of dry paper, leather, and a faint, metallic tang of old blood magic. There were no poets, no playwrights, no histories of lands beyond the kingdom's shadowed borders. There were only tomes on curses, bloodlines, and dark rituals, their pages filled with spidery, obsessive script. The gardens were beautiful, a riot of pale, moonlight-colored flowers and manicured hedges, but they were enclosed by sheer, unscalable walls of the same black stone as the keep, a perfect, open-air prison. Everything was a beautiful trap. Leo remained weak, a fragile ghost haunting the opulent rooms. The castle's maester, a pinched-faced man with nervous hands, provided him with foul-smelling tinctures that seemed to do little more than deepen his sleep, offering no true healing. Bryn rarely left the boy's side, a furry brown shadow of unwavering loyalty. Refusing to be a passive vessel awaiting her fate, Aurora began to read. She spent hours in the dusty silence of the library, her fingers tracing the faded ink of ancient texts. She searched for information on the Veyra curse, on the pact that bound her family to theirs, and on her own lineage. The book spoke of her ancestors, the Lanes, as being sun-touched, a bloodline gifted with a rare life energy. Though the specifics were always frustratingly vague, it was in a crumbling, fragmented scroll, tucked inside a larger volume on soul binding, that she found the first crucial clue. It spoke of a ritual of purification, one that required the willing sacrifice of a sun-touched soul to cleanse a cursed bloodline. The word willing snagged in her mind, a tiny, sharp hook of possibility. What if she was not willing? What would happen then? Her first real interaction with Kael since his chilling warning came on the third day. He found her in the library, perched on a ladder with a heavy book open on her lap. He didn't make a sound, but she felt his presence, a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling on her skin. She looked down to see him standing at the foot of the ladder, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his frozen lake eyes watching her with cold dismissal. "Looking for an escape?" he asked, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. "There is none. The sooner you accept your purpose, the less you will suffer." Aurora's fear was a familiar knot in her stomach, but her research had given her a sliver of ground to stand on. She closed the book and met his gaze directly. "I'm looking for understanding," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "If my soul is the price, I deserve to know why." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise at her directness, crossed his features before being instantly suppressed. He had expected tears, pleading, terror, not this quiet defiance. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions. Then, without another word, he turned and strode from the library, his black cloak swirling behind him like a piece of the night. The brief, almost imperceptible crack in his cold exterior gave Aurora a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling. Hope. That hope was nearly extinguished 2 nights later. A vicious storm broke over the keep, the wind howling like a hungry wolf around the stone towers, and rain lashing against the thick glass of the windows. The storm outside was a mirror to the one that erupted in their rooms. Leo's cough worsened dramatically, becoming a series of harsh, ragged gasps that left him trembling and blue-lipped. His fever spiked, his small body burning with a heat that terrified Aurora. The maester was nowhere to be found, the servants helpless, frantic. Aurora knew she had no choice. Leaving Leo in Bryn's watchful care, she ran from the rooms, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone of the echoing halls. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find him. A strange humming energy drew her towards a part of the keep she had not yet seen. She found Kael in a large circular chamber, the walls and floor of which were covered in a complex web of glowing green runes. In the center of the room, a vortex of swirling, shadowy energy was contained within a circle of waist-high stones, pulsing with a malevolent light. Kael stood before it, his back to her, his entire body rigid with tension. His breathing was ragged, a harsh, guttural sound that was barely human. He seemed to be in agony, fighting a battle she could not see. He turned as she entered, and her heart seized in her chest. This was the beast he had warned her about. His eyes were no longer the color of ice. They were glowing with a faint, predatory green light, the same sickly color as the runes. His features seemed subtly distorted, sharper, more feral. He looked at her, and for a terrifying moment, she saw no recognition, only a predator sizing up its prey. Panic gave her voice a raw, desperate edge. "My brother!" she cried, the words tumbling out. "He can't breathe. Please, you have to help me." Her plea, so full of pure, unadulterated desperation, seemed to cut through the trance that held him. The feral light in his eyes receded, like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind the familiar, cold blue. He blinked, looking at her, then past her, a flicker of some unidentifiable emotion, perhaps confusion, crossing his face. Without a single word, he strode past her, his long legs eating up the distance back to her rooms. Aurora followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He knelt by Leo's bed, a giant of a man next to the frail, struggling child. His hands, which she had only imagined as instruments of violence, were surprisingly gentle as he rested one on the boy's forehead, his touch steady and assessing. He turned his head and spoke in a low, commanding tone to one of the guards who had appeared in the doorway. He ordered a specific remedy, a poultice of crushed silver leaf and moon petal. An herbal combination the maester had completely overlooked. The guard scurried away to obey. Kael remained kneeling by the bed, his presence a silent, powerful vigil, until the remedy was applied and Leo's breathing finally began to ease. He had shown a moment of knowledge, of care, of something akin to compassion, and it left Aurora utterly confused, staring at the deep, undeniable crack in the monster's facade. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale Sunday. Aurora sat with Leo in the enclosed castle garden, the boy propped up with pillows on a stone bench, looking weak but breathing easier. Bryn lay at their feet, his head resting on Aurora's lap, his tail giving a soft thump against the stone every now and then. The garden, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed like a sanctuary, a small pocket of peace in the oppressive keep. Kael appeared at the edge of the garden, a silent shadow against the bright morning. He didn't speak, his gaze fixed on Leo. Aurora tensed, expecting a return to the cold cruelty, a dismissal of the previous night's events, but it was Bryn who moved first. The Labrador, who had only ever growled and bristled in the king's presence, lifted his head. He stood, stretched, and then, to Aurora's astonishment, he walked slowly and deliberately towards the Alpha King. He stopped before Kael and nudged his large, unmoving hand with his wet nose. Kael flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement, as if he had been burned. He stared down at the dog, his expression a mixture of profound confusion and something that looked startlingly like pain. He seemed utterly unprepared for such a simple, unconditional gesture of affection. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hand and rested it on Bryn's broad, furry head. He stood there for a long moment, his fingers buried in the dog's thick coat, just looking down at the trusting animal. "Bryn likes you," Leo said, his voice small but clear in the quiet garden. "He doesn't like strangers." Kael's gaze shifted to the boy, and his own voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it for a long time. "He is a loyal animal." Aurora watched the scene, her heart aching with a strange, contradictory mix of emotions. She spoke quietly, her words a simple statement, not an accusation. "He knows who helped you last night." Kael's reaction was immediate. He snatched his hand back from Bryn as if the dog's fur had suddenly turned to fire. The walls he had built around himself, the ones that had cracked and crumbled the night before, were instantly rebuilt, higher and colder than ever. Without another glance at her, or the boy, or the dog, he turned and left the garden, his retreat as abrupt and absolute as a slamming door. He left a hollow silence in his wake, a void that highlighted the fierce, internal war he was so clearly losing. Aurora watched him go, a newfound resolve hardening within her. She had seen the man behind the beast, and she would not let him hide again. That quiet defiance, born from a mother's love and a captive's desperation, became Aurora's armor. She would not let Kael's abrupt departure deter her. She had seen the man, however briefly, and that glimpse was enough to fuel a new, more focused determination. Her research in the library became less about escape and more about excavation, digging for the root of the curse that entangled both their families. She realized she could not do it alone, not with the most important texts locked away in a section of the library forbidden to all but the king himself. Her opportunity came in the form of Alara, an elderly servant who had served in the keep for more than 60 years. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands gnarled with age, but her eyes held a sharp, knowing light that missed nothing. Alara had seen Kael's father and his grandfather struggle with the same shadow, and she saw in Aurora not a vessel, but a potential end to the cycle. One evening, as Aurora was replacing a heavy tome, Alara approached her, a single iron key held loosely in her palm. "Some stories are locked away for a reason, child," the old woman whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "But sometimes the locks are on the wrong doors." She pressed the cold, heavy key into Aurora's hand and gestured with her chin towards a towering, iron-bound door at the far end of the library. "The Veyra kings kept their secrets there. Perhaps one of them holds your freedom." With a heart that beat a nervous tattoo against her ribs, Aurora waited until the keep fell into the deep silence of the hours past midnight. She slipped into the library, the single key feeling like a brand in her hand. The lock turned with a loud, groaning click that seemed to echo in the vast space. The air that billowed out from the lock section was different, thick with the dust of centuries and the palpable weight of forgotten pain. This was not just a collection of books, it was a tomb of tormented minds. Here, she found the private journals of the Veyra kings, bound in cracking leather and sealed with faded wax. She found the one she was looking for almost immediately, its cover made of black wolf hide, the name Malachi Veyra tooled into it in silver. He was the first, the origin of the curse. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The script inside was a frantic, deteriorating scrawl, the elegant prose of a king devolving into the desperate scratches of a man losing his mind. Malachi wrote of the curse not as an illness, but as a sentient thing, a shadow entity that had attached itself to his soul, feeding on his life force, whispering poison into his thoughts. As she read, Aurora's horror grew. She discovered the true origin of the pact, and it was nothing like the cold, cruel debt Kael had described. Malachi's best friend, a man named Alpha Lane, her own ancestor, had been a powerful healer, renowned for his knowledge of life energies. When he realized he could not break the curse, he forged the pact as a last resort, a way to contain the shadow, linking their bloodlines in a desperate act of friendship. The pact stated that a sun-touched soul from the Lane bloodline, a soul brimming with pure life energy, could purify the Veyra line and destroy the entity. But the journal ended with a final, chilling entry, written on a page stained with what looked like dried blood, the script barely legible. Aurora leaned close, her breath catching in her throat as she deciphered the words. "My dearest Alistair Lane has bound our fates," Malachi had written. "He speaks of a sun-touched soul from his line, a beacon in the dark, but the shadow whispers to me. It tells me purification is a lie. It says the soul will not be a key, but a feast. A feast." The word echoed in the silent, dusty room, and a cold dread, far deeper than any she had yet felt, settled into Aurora's bones. She felt a strange, sorrowful connection to her ancestor, Alistair, a man who had acted out of love, only to create a trap, and she felt a new, heavier weight of responsibility. This was not just about her life, or even Leo's. It was about a 500-year-old tragedy that she was now at the center of. 2 days later, Kael did something that shattered the routine of their strange existence. He sent a servant to summon her and Leo, not to the cavernous, empty great hall for a formal meal, but to his private study. Aurora was hesitant, but the summons had been polite, an invitation rather than a command. She found the room was a reflection of the man himself, a place of contradictions. It was dominated by maps of the kingdom and racks of gleaming, deadly weapons, yet a warm, cheerful fire burned in a massive stone hearth, and the chairs pulled up to the heavy oak table were cushioned and comfortable. It was a warrior's room, but it was also, undeniably, a home. The meal was tense and awkward at first, the silence broken only by the clinking of silverware and the crackle of the fire. Leo, however, emboldened by Kael's previous kindness and his own childlike curiosity, seemed to feel none of the tension. He stared at the king with wide, inquisitive eyes. "Are the wolves your friends?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the silence. Kael, who had been staring into his wine goblet, looked up, startled. He seemed at a loss for how to respond to such a direct, simple question. He looked at Leo, and the hard lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. "They are," he said, his voice lacking its usual harsh edge. "I knew the name of every wolf in the pack when I was your age. They were more my family than the people in this castle." The admission was a brief, unguarded glimpse into a profoundly lonely childhood, a boy who found more solace with beasts than with men. Aurora listened, her heart aching for the lonely child he must have been. This small confession gave her the courage she needed. She had to know if he understood the truth of their shared history. "I read about Malachi," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and about my ancestor, Alistair Lane. The pact wasn't made out of malice, Kael. It was made out of love, out of friendship." His name on her lips sounded both strange and intimate. Kael's face darkened instantly. The brief warmth in the room vanished, sucked away by the returning frost. The walls he had momentarily lowered went back up, fortified and impenetrable. "Love is a luxury the cursed cannot afford," he said, his voice once again the cold, flat rumble of a king. "Friendship is a memory that turns to ash. All that matters is the price, the feast." He had read the journal too, he knew, and he still intended to see it through. The pang of disappointment Aurora felt was sharp and painful, but it was mixed with a stronger, more stubborn resolve. She had seen the man behind the monster again, and she refused to believe he was gone for good. That night, unable to sleep, Aurora returned to Malachi's journal. The mention of a feast haunted her, but it was a cryptic drawing on the inside back cover that now held her attention. It was a map, not of a land, but of the keep itself, showing a hidden passage behind a tapestry in the library. It led, according to the spidery arrows, down into the very foundations of the castle. Driven by a desperate need for answers, she took a single torch and followed the map. The tapestry, depicting a great white wolf battling a shadowy serpent, swung aside to reveal a narrow, spiraling staircase. The air that rose from it cold and smelling of damp earth and something else, something ancient and malevolent. Her torch cast flickering, dancing shadows as she descended, the stone steps slick with moisture. The air grew colder, humming with a low, oppressive energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The staircase opened into a vast, circular chamber deep beneath the keep. This was the true heart of the curse. In the center of the chamber stood a single, massive block of black, unadorned stone, an altar. Carved into the floor all around it was a massive, complex runic circle, the lines filled with a dark, oily substance that seemed to drink the torchlight. The air hummed with a palpable malice, a hungry, waiting power. This was where the ritual was meant to take place. This was where her soul was to be consumed. As she circled the room, her light fell upon another set of carvings on the far wall. They were different from the Veyra runes on the floor, smaller, more elegant. With a jolt that shot through her entire body, she recognized the script. It was the script of her own ancestors, the same script she had seen in old herbalist guides her mother had kept. It was a warning. Her hands shaking, she held the torch closer, her blood turning to ice as she read the words carved into the stone, a message from Aurora Lane to his descendants. The warning laid out the final horrific truth of the pact. The purification was a lie. A deception whispered into Malachi's ear by the shadow entity itself. The ritual did not destroy the curse. It did not cleanse the Veyra bloodline. It transferred it. The sun-touched soul, with its immense life energy, was not a key to lock the beast away. It was a perfect, empty vessel for it. The ritual would act as a conduit, pulling the sentient shadow from the Veyra king and forcing it into the Lane sacrifice. The soul would be consumed, the person who housed it trapped in a state of living death, their body becoming the new prison for the ancient, hungry entity. The Veyra king would be freed, his line cleansed, but only at the cost of damning someone else to take his place. Aurora stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The torchlight wavered, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to writhe and grasp for her. She stared at the altar, at the hungry runes, and a new, chilling thought pierced through her terror. Kael had spoken of the price, of the feast. But did he know this? Did he truly understand that he was not asking her to die, but asking her to take his place in a hell he had lived in his entire life? The realization settled over her, a cold, heavy certainty. He didn't. The Veyra kings, in their desperation, had likely edited the truth over the centuries, softening it from a damnation to a noble sacrifice. The fear that had been her constant companion since that first night in the cottage did not vanish, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of cold, righteous anger. He was not just her captor, he was a victim, just as she was, both of them caught in a 500-year-old lie, and he was about to make her his replacement in a prison he didn't even know had a revolving door. That righteous anger was a fire in her veins, burning away the last vestiges of her fear. Aurora didn't return to her rooms. She didn't cower and wait for the morning. The truth was a weapon, and she intended to wield it. She ascended the spiral stairs from the cold, damp chamber, her torch held high, the flame a reflection of the fury in her eyes. She knew where to find him. The servants had whispered that on nights when the moon was waxing, when the curse grew restless within him, the king would often go to the armory, losing himself in the rhythm of sharpening steel, a physical task to distract a tormented mind. She strode through the silent corridors, her purpose a shield against the oppressive shadows of the keep. The rhythmic, grating sound of steel on whetstone grew louder as she approached, a sharp, angry sound that set her teeth on edge. She found him there, alone in the vast stone-walled armory. The air smelled of cold metal, oil, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone from a nearby forge. He was shirtless, his back to her, the muscles of his shoulders and arms cording with effort as he drew a massive broadsword across the spinning whetstone. Sparks flew, brief, fiery stars in the gloom. He was a figure of immense power, a warrior king in his element. A week ago, the sight would have terrified her. Now, it only fueled her anger. She walked right up to him, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor, and the grating rhythm of the stone was the only sound until she spoke, her voice cutting through the noise, clear and cold as a winter morning. "You lied to me." The grinding stopped abruptly. He froze, every muscle in his powerful back going rigid. Slowly, he placed the sword down on a nearby rack, the heavy steel making a soft metallic clang. He turned to face her, his face a mask of stone, his eyes narrowed. He had been expecting her to be broken, not defiant. "I told you it required your soul," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "That is the truth. It is a fraction of the truth, and you know it," she shot back, taking a step closer, refusing to be intimidated. "You didn't tell me it was a transfer, not a purification. You didn't tell me I would become the new vessel for your family's demon. Does it make the sacrifice easier? Asking for my soul without telling me you're handing me your damnation?" The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The mask of stone did not just crack, it shattered. His eyes widened, the frozen blue suddenly turbulent with shock and a dawning sickening horror. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, and in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that her chilling suspicion had been correct. He hadn't known. The centuries of Veyra desperation had edited the truth, softening a damnation into a noble sacrifice, and he had believed the lie as fervently as she had. The realization that he had been about to inflict his own monstrous fate upon her, unknowingly, washed over his face, leaving him pale and shaken. He looked utterly lost. "What?" he finally managed to say, his voice strained, hoarse, a mere ghost of its usual commanding tone. "What did you find?" His raw shock and self-loathing were so palpable that Aurora's anger began to cool, replaced by a complicated, aching pity. They were not captor and captive. They were two people trapped on opposite sides of the same cursed coin. Without a word, she turned and led the way back to the library, back to the tapestry of the wolf and the serpent. He followed her, his steps heavy, the powerful king now a man adrift in a sea of horrifying new knowledge. She led him down the spiraling stairs, into the cold, malevolent heart of his own castle. He stopped dead at the entrance to the chamber, his gaze fixed on the hungry runes and the dark altar. Aurora led him to the far wall, lifting her torch to illuminate the elegant, ancient script left by her ancestor. Kael reached out a trembling hand and traced the carved letters, his face a mask of pale disgust as he read the truth for himself. "For generations," he whispered, his voice filled with a profound, soul-deep revulsion, "my family has sought this cure. We believed it was a noble sacrifice to end our suffering." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a torment that mirrored what she had seen in Malachi's journal. "We never knew it was just passing the pain to another." He slammed his fist against the stone wall, a single, sharp crack of sound that was followed by a heavy, suffocating silence. He was not just a king burdened by a curse, he was the heir to a legacy of lies, a potential monster who had almost damned an innocent woman out of sheer ignorance. They returned to the library, the atmosphere between them thick with unspoken emotions. The dynamic had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. A fragile, unspoken alliance was formed in the shared horror of their discovery. They now had a common enemy, not just the shadow entity, but the centuries of deception that had fed it. "There has to be another way," Aurora insisted, her voice gaining strength. "My ancestor and yours were friends. They wouldn't have created a trap without a key, a true way out." Hope, fragile as it was, was a more powerful motivator than fear. They began to work, not as captor and captive, but as partners. They pored over the Veyra journals and the fragmented Lane family scrolls that Alara helped Aurora procure. They spent hours in the dusty silence, the only sounds the rustle of ancient parchment and their own quiet breathing. They sat side by side at the heavy oak table, cross-referencing Veyra histories with Lane herbalist guides, searching for any discrepancy, any hidden clue. The library was no longer a place of lonely research for Aurora, but a council room for two. The description of their work focused on their growing proximity, the way their hands would brush as they reached for the same book, the shared, frustrated sighs, and the quick, hopeful glances when a passage seemed promising. They were two souls adrift, clinging to the same small raft in a storm-tossed sea. The storm, however, was not just in the past. It was gathering again, its fury tied to the relentless cycle of the moon. Kael's emotional turmoil, the shattering of his lifelong beliefs, had weakened his control over the curse. The full moon rose 2 nights later, a perfect, silver disk in a cloudless sky, and its light was a catalyst. He felt the change coming on faster and more violently than ever before. He tried to lock himself away in the rune chamber, the place where he usually fought his silent, agonizing battles. But this time, the beast would not be contained. A guttural roar of pure agony and rage echoed through the keep, a sound that was not entirely human. The heavy stone door of the rune chamber splintered, then burst from its hinges as he erupted into the hallway. He was no longer Kael. His eyes glowed with the same malevolent green light as the runes. His features were distorted, elongated into a feral snarl. His body was twisted, larger, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace. He was the beast he had warned her about, a creature of nightmare and shadow given flesh. The castle guards, brave and loyal, tried to contain him, forming a wall of steel and armor. He swatted them away, as if they were flies, their bodies thrown against the stone walls with inhuman strength. He was not fighting them. He was being drawn, pulled by an instinct older and more powerful than reason, towards the one thing the sentient curse now desired above all else. The bright, shining beacon of the sun-touched soul. He stormed towards their rooms, his claws tearing deep gouges in the stone floor. Aurora heard the screams, the clash of steel, and the terrifying roars. She grabbed Leo, pulling him from his bed, and pushed him behind her just as the door to their chamber was ripped from its frame. The beast that was Kael filled the doorway, its glowing eyes fixing on her. Leo screamed, a high, terrified sound, and buried his face in Aurora's dress. Bryn, ever the protector, stood his ground in front of them both, his body low, barking furiously, a desperate, valiant defense against a tidal wave of darkness. But the beast barely seemed to notice the dog. Its entire focus was on her. Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But she stood her ground, her body a shield for her brother. She looked into those glowing, monstrous eyes, and she did not scream. She did the one thing she could, the only thing that mattered. She spoke his name, her voice shaking but miraculously clear in the chaos. Kael, it's me, it's Aurora, fight it. The beast hesitated. Its snarling muzzle was inches from her face, its hot, foul breath washing over her. For a single, heart-stopping moment, a flicker of recognition of the man, of Kael, surfaced in the depths of those glowing green eyes. A low, agonized sound tore from its throat, a snarl of profound conflict and pain. It was fighting itself, the man versus the demon. It raised a massive, clawed hand, the sharpened points gleaming in the moonlight filtering through the window. For a terrifying second, Aurora was certain it would strike her down. Instead, with a final, guttural roar of denial, the beast turned. Didn't retreat back down the hall. It smashed its way through the thick stone wall of the chamber, stone and plaster exploding outwards into the night. It chose to hurl itself from the castle tower, to flee into the darkness, rather than harm her. Aurora was left shaking uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her brother, staring at the gaping hole in the wall, her heart filled not just with terror, but with a profound, aching pity for the man who had just saved her from himself. The dawn that followed the night of the beast was unnaturally quiet. The storm of the transformation had passed, leaving a trail of destruction and a heavy, waiting silence in its wake. The castle itself seemed to be holding its breath. Guards moved with hushed reverence, clearing splintered wood and shattered stone, their faces pale and grim. Aurora had not slept. She had sat by the gaping hole in her wall, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the stars fade and the sky slowly bleed from black to gray to a soft, bruised purple. Leo slept soundly in his bed, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, with Bryn curled on the floor beside him, the dog's occasional sigh the only sound in the room. Just as the first rays of sun crested the distant mountains, painting the edges of the clouds in gold, she saw him. He stumbled out of the dark woods that bordered the castle grounds, a lone figure moving with a bone-deep weariness that was painful to watch. He was human again, but only just. His fine clothes were torn to shreds, caked in mud and what looked like dried blood. He was limping, his body covered in cuts and deep scratches, a testament to the violent battle he had fought with himself. He made his way not to the main gate, but towards the base of the tower where her room was, collapsing onto the dew-soaked grass near the rubble of the wall he had destroyed. Aurora didn't hesitate. She didn't call the guards or the maester. She moved with a quiet purpose that came from a place beyond fear. She found a clean basin in her washroom, filled it with warm water from the pitcher by the hearth, and gathered soft linen cloths. Carrying her supplies, she made her way through the broken doorway and down a service staircase, emerging into the cool morning air. Leo and Bryn appeared in the hole in the wall above, two small figures watching her, their expressions not of fear, but of a solemn, shared sadness. Kael didn't move as she approached. He was curled on his side, his face turned away from her, a posture of profound defeat. She knelt beside him in the damp grass, the basin making a soft thud as she set it down. He was shivering, whether from cold or from the aftermath of the transformation, she didn't know. She dipped a cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and gently began to clean a long, shallow cut on his arm. He flinched violently at her touch, but didn't pull away. He was ashamed, so deeply ashamed that he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. "You should have let the guards kill me," he rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing. "You saw what I am." Aurora paused in her work, her hand hovering over his arm. She moved around so she could see his face, which was streaked with dirt and etched with self-loathing. She spoke softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to his harsh despair. "I saw you fight it," she said, her gaze unwavering. She dabbed the cloth at a cut on his cheekbone, her touch incredibly gentle. "I saw you choose to spare me. That's what I saw." He finally looked at her. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake now clouded with pain, were filled with a raw, burgeoning emotion he could no longer suppress or deny. All the walls, all the armor, all the centuries of cold Veyra pride were gone, washed away in a tide of agony and gratitude. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers trembling, and gently, so gently, touched her cheek. It was not the touch of a king, or a captor, or a beast. It was the touch of a man, lost and broken, reaching for his only anchor in a world of darkness. The connection was pure, unspoken, a silent confession of feelings that ran far deeper than the curse that had defined him. In that moment, her quiet, steady compassion became his salvation, and his vulnerable, desperate touch became her own undoing. The aftermath of the full moon left them with a new, frantic urgency. The fragile alliance forged in the secret chamber had been irrevocably sealed by the night's events. They both knew, without having to say it, that the next transformation would be worse. His control was slipping, weakened by the emotional upheaval and the curse's growing desperation to claim its prize. They were in a race against the next rise of the moon. Their research in the library became a frantic, desperate scramble for a solution that was not a damnation. They worked side by side from dawn until long after the castle had fallen silent. The vast library, their sanctuary, and their battlefield. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the shared, unspoken fear of the ticking clock. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected of places. It was not in a dark Veyra tome of shadow magic, but in a slim, unassuming herbalist guide bound in green leather, a book from the Lane family collection that Alara had found for her. Tucked into the back, In a section on purifying energies was a hidden annotation, written in the same elegant script as the warning in the chamber below. It was another message from her ancestor, Aurora Lane. It spoke of a severing ritual. It was a dangerous, almost mythical alternative to the transfer. It didn't seek to move the curse, it sought to sever the sentient shadow entity from the Veyra bloodline entirely, to kill the demon, not just rehouse it. Aurora read the passage aloud, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. The ritual required two key components, a metaphysical anchor and a spiritual catalyst. It requires an anchor of immense emotional power, she read, her eyes wide, to hold the king's humanity in place while the shadow is ripped away, preventing his mind from shattering under the strain. She looked at Kael, her heart pounding, the unspoken truth hanging in the air between them. The anchor had to be love, not a memory of it, not a vague affection, but a powerful, willing, and reciprocated emotional bond. And the catalyst, she continued, her voice barely a whisper, is a source of pure life energy, used to fuel the severing. She looked up from the book, her gaze locking with his. The catalyst is the sun-touched soul, not to be consumed, Kael, not a feast. It's to be used as a source of power, a battery to fuel the ritual that kills the shadow. The risk was enormous, a gamble of terrifying proportions. The text was explicit. If the emotional anchor, their love, wasn't strong enough to hold him, Kael's mind would shatter, leaving him a mindless, empty shell, his body alive but his soul gone forever. And if the catalyst, her soul's energy, wasn't perfectly controlled, if she couldn't pull back at the right moment, the ritual could drain her completely, consuming her life force just as the transfer would have. It was a choice between three terrible fates: Kael's inevitable descent into a permanent monstrous form, Aurora's damnation as the new vessel, or a shared, desperate gamble that could utterly destroy them both. The dusty herbalist guide, a symbol of life and healing, had given them their only true hope, but it was a hope balanced on the razor's edge of their own hearts. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and unspoken tension. The full moon was coming, a silent, looming promise of destruction. On the final evening, as a blood-orange sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the kingdom, Aurora found Kael standing on the highest battlements of the keep. He was looking out over his lands, the wind whipping his dark hair around his face. The air was cold and clear, and for the first time, Aurora saw the beauty of the kingdom, the rolling hills and dense forests, a land that had been shrouded by the curse for half a millennia. She stood beside him, not as his captive, but as his partner, two people facing an impossible choice together. The silence stretched, comfortable now, not awkward. He was the one to finally break it, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I told you not to look for a heart," he began, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I was wrong. You didn't just find it, you reignited it from the ashes." He finally turned to her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes stole her breath. The king was gone, the beast was gone, only the man remained. "The thought of you, taking my place in that darkness, it is a torment worse than any curse, worse than any transformation." He took her hands in his grip firm and warm. "I love you, Aurora. I think I have from the moment you stood in that cottage, so small and yet so fierce, and defied me for the sake of your brother." A single painful tear traced a path down his cheek. "And it is because I love you that I cannot let you do this. The risk is too great. I cannot ask you to gamble your soul for mine." His confession was not smooth or poetic. It was raw, desperate, and utterly real. The words of a man who had been starved of love his entire life. Aurora felt her own tears welling, but her voice was steady when she replied, her hands tightening their grip on his. "And it's because I love you that I can't let you suffer any longer," she said, her heart aching with the depth of her conviction. "You said love was a luxury the cursed cannot afford. But what if it's the only thing that can save you? The only thing that can save us?" She stepped closer, looking up into his tormented eyes, her resolve as strong and unyielding as the ancient stones beneath their feet. "This is my choice now. It is not a debt being paid, or a pact being honored. It is my choice, Kael. I choose to fight for you. I choose to fight for us. He searched her face, looking for any hint of doubt, any flicker of fear, but he found only a love as fierce and determined as his own. He leaned down and rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. A sound of surrender, of acceptance, of terror and hope all mingled into one. They stood there as the last light of the sun faded and the first stars began to prick the velvet sky, holding hands in a silent agreement. They would face the ritual and the demon together. The night of the full moon arrived not with a storm, but with a profound and unnerving stillness. The air in the secret chamber beneath the keep was cold and electric, humming with a contained, hungry power. The complex runic circle carved into the floor glowed with a sickly, malevolent green light, the oily lines pulsing like the veins of some great, sleeping beast. The shadows in the corners of the room were deep and absolute, seeming to writhe just at the edge of vision. Upstairs, in the relative warmth and safety of the library, Leo was waiting with Alara, a silent vigil kept by a small boy and an old woman. Bryn was with them, his head resting on Leo's lap, his sensitive ears twitching at every groan of the ancient castle. Down below, in the heart of the curse, there were only two people. Kael stood in the exact center of the glowing circle, his face pale but his jaw set with a grim resolve. He wore simple black trousers and a loose white shirt, stripped of all armor and royal regalia. He was not a king tonight, just a man facing his demon. Aurora stood just outside the circle's edge, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was the catalyst, the battery, the spark that would either ignite their salvation or consume them both in its fire. They had only this one last moment before the moon reached its zenith, before the ritual began. He looked at her, his eyes, those frozen lakes, now turbulent with love and terror. "If my mind breaks," he said, his voice low and steady despite the tremor she could feel running through him. "If I am lost in the severing, you must promise me you will leave. Take your brother and run. Do not let my legacy become your prison." Tears welled in Aurora's eyes, but she shook her head, a fierce, defiant gesture. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward, right to the edge of the glowing runes, and placed her hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel its frantic, powerful beat against her palm. "This is our anchor, Kael. This feeling, right here. Remember it. Remember me." He closed his eyes, a shudder racking his body as he leaned into her touch. Then his eyes opened, and he surged forward, closing the small distance between them. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, passionate, and brutal claiming, a kiss that was both a final, agonizing farewell and a sacred, unbreakable promise. It was the taste of winter and fire, of desperation and hope, of a love that had been forged in the darkest of places. It was the physical manifestation of their anchor, a focal point for all their shared moments, the arguments and the truces, the fear and the forgiveness, the kindness and the pain. When he pulled back, his eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective love that mirrored her own. The time for words was over. As if on cue, a single, pure beam of moonlight lanced through a high grate in the chamber wall, striking the center of the runic circle. The full moon had reached its zenith. The ritual began. The green light of the runes flared, intensifying from a glow to a blinding glare. Kael threw his head back and screamed. It was not a sound of anger or battle, but of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that was ripped from the very depths of his soul as the shadow entity, bound to his bloodline for 5 centuries, was violently torn from its host. His body convulsed, lifted from the floor by an unseen force, his muscles cording as he fought against the parasitic demon that had been his lifelong companion. Then, the shadow began to manifest. It poured from him like black smoke, a writhing, cohesive mass of darkness and pure malice that coalesced in the air above the altar. It had no true form, yet it had eyes, points of burning, hateful red, that fixed not on the writhing, screaming man it had just vacated, but on Aurora. She was the prize. She was the new, perfect vessel it had been promised. With a soundless shriek that echoed directly in her mind, a wave of pure terror and despair, the shadow entity lunged for her. But Aurora was ready. She was not a passive sacrifice. She was not a simple battery. She was a warrior. She pushed her own energy, her sun-touched power, into the runic circle. It was not a gentle healing light. It was a blazing, defiant, golden fire, a torrent of pure life energy that erupted from her and flooded the runes, turning their sickly green to a brilliant, holy gold. The chamber, which had been filled with a malevolent cold, was suddenly flooded with an intense, cleansing heat. The shadow recoiled, hissing, as the golden light seared its edges. Kael, weakened and gasping on the floor but miraculously free of the entity's hold, fought to stay conscious. His mind felt frayed, on the verge of shattering, but he clung to the memory of her touch, of her kiss, of her voice. Her love was the anchor that held the pieces of his sanity together. He saw the shadow lunging for her, and a primal roar of protective fury erupted from his chest. "Aurora!" he shouted, his voice the anchor she now needed, a tether back to the world of the living. "Hold on, I am here!" His voice cut through the psychic chaos. She looked at him, at the man she loved, lying broken but free on the floor, and her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She poured everything she was, every ounce of her love, her defiance, her hope, into the light. She was the sun, and the shadow could not stand before her. The golden energy did not just power the ritual of severing, it actively fought the darkness, a weapon of pure life against an entity of pure decay. The shadow entity shrieked again, a sound of disbelief and agony as the light of a single, defiant soul not only repelled it, but began to unmake it. It was burned away from the inside out, its ancient malice dissolving like smoke in a hurricane. Its 500-year reign of terror ended not by a dark bargain, but by the pure, unwavering power of a heart that had refused to let go. The final, agonized scream echoed in the chamber, and then there was only a profound, ringing silence. The aftermath was a world of quiet and exhaustion. The brilliant golden light faded, and the runes on the floor went dark, their power expended, leaving them as nothing more than dead, black carvings in the stone. The chamber was just a cold, empty room once more. Kael lay collapsed on the floor, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. He was human, he was whole, he was free. Across the room, Aurora slid to the floor, her body trembling with a bone-deep weariness, her energy utterly spent. She was drained, pale as a ghost, but she was alive, and her soul was still her own. They crawled towards each other across the cold stone, their movements slow and clumsy. There were no words, there was no need for them. They reached the center of the room and simply held each other, their bodies shaking with the aftershocks of the battle and the overwhelming, crushing weight of their relief. It was a relief so profound it was a physical presence, a heavy, warm blanket settling over them. They had faced the abyss together, and they had won. Hand in hand, they slowly made their way out of the chamber and up the spiral stairs. As they emerged into the main body of the keep, the first rays of dawn were streaming through the high windows, flooding the great hall with a warm, golden light that Aurora had never seen within these walls before. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere of the keep was gone, replaced by a feeling of lightness, of peace. The dark stones of the walls seemed to look warm in the morning sunday. As they stood there, blinking in the sudden brightness, they heard the frantic scrabbling of paws and a child's joyful shout. Leo and Bryn came hurtling down the main staircase. Leo launched himself at them, his small arms wrapping around both their legs in a fierce, happy hug. Bryn, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook, began licking their hands, their faces, anything he could reach, whining with pure, unadulterated joy. It was not a king and his consort. It was not a captor and his prize. It was a family, forged in fire and shadow, finally reunited in the light. Months later, the keep was utterly transformed. Dark, heavy tapestries depicting battles and beasts had been replaced with bright, colorful weavings of landscapes and thriving villages. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of life, of servants bustling with cheerful efficiency, and most notably, by the sound of children's laughter. The great hall, once a cold, echoing tomb, was now often filled with children from the nearby village, where Leo, now rosy-cheeked and full of energy, played with his new friends. The gardens were no longer enclosed, their walls replaced with low, welcoming hedges, the beautiful flowers now a gift for all to see. Not a private treasure for a lonely king. Kael himself was a different man. The harsh, cold lines of his face had softened, replaced by a warmth and compassion that radiated from him. He was no longer just the Alpha King, a title spoken with fear. He was King Kael, a true king, who ruled with a wisdom and empathy born from his own immense suffering. He was often seen in the village, not as a distant ruler, but as a man among his people. His deep voice, once used for commands, now often heard in laughter. Aurora stood with him on the battlements, the same battlements where he had confessed his love in a moment of desperate fear. The sun was warm on her face, and a gentle breeze played with her hair. She was not his consort or his queen in title, but his partner in every sense of the word. Her hand rested on her own slightly rounded stomach, a silent, happy promise of their future. Bryn rested at their feet, his great head resting contentedly on Kael's boot. Kael looked down at her, his eyes, once the color of a frozen lake, now as warm and blue as a summer sky. "You gave me back my soul," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was still new to him. Aurora smiled, a soft, radiant expression that lit up her whole face. She reached up and touched his cheek, her love for him a steady, burning flame in her heart. "No," she corrected him gently. "You never lost it. It was just buried beneath 5 centuries of pain." She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at their peaceful, sun-drenched kingdom. "My heart refused to let you go, and yours, in the end, refused to let me go. That's what saved us." He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, and together they watched the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. It was a new dawn for their kingdom, a new era built not on pacts of debt and sacrifice, but on the enduring, unyielding power of a love that had been strong enough to conquer a curse and bring light back to a world of shadows. Theirs was a hard-won peace, a testament to a love that had stared into the abyss and chosen not to surrender, creating their own happily ever after.